Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back. So this is another video talking about the ESO PTS. These are the patch notes for the Dragonhold patch. Should be coming out within the next few months. I did want to talk about some of the changes to one sets, and of course, something that finally, I had talked about this. I don't know how many videos about how to make the battleground queue so much easier. Excuse me while I move myself over. I've been talking about this for a while, where you'd get a ready check and it would just say, someone declined, yada yada yada, and just rinse and repeat. And I said it so many times, instead of having it basically re-kick everybody into the queue system, just automatically port everybody in. It's so frustrating for your players to deal with that, and I'm so very thankful that they finally actually went and did this. I have no idea whether they watched any of my videos or not, but I had been saying this for patch after patch about it. Thankfully, it did go in, where it says a beautiful change to the battleground queue system, where it says accepting a ready check for a battleground will now immediately send you to the battleground. This is to help avoid a common situation where repeated ready checks happened with only one or two players and not accepting them. And that's the point, where you get like one or two people who didn't accept it. Maybe they were AFK, maybe they were waiting for a battleground and stepped away for a second, and then they missed the ready check for whatever reason. Maybe they were in the middle of a dungeon. They're like, you know what, I'm not going to accept the ready check, and they just let it time out. And then all the other players would basically get thrown right back into the queue system. Thankfully, this changed, because the battleground will continue to find replacements for players that declined or timed out of the ready check. If the battleground cannot find at least 3 players per team after 5 minutes, the battleground will close and you will not receive a leaver penalty. And this is fantastic also for people who were getting into BG queues, and it pulled you, and like one team had 2 and the other teams had 4. So at the very least, and I've had matches where the BG starts with 2 players on one team, and then the other teams have like 3 and 4, and then it just starts, and I'm like, what the hell is going on? So this is at least an excellent change for battlegrounds, where you're no longer gonna get that someone declined over and over and over again. Thank you for making this change. This is a very valuable change to limit the amount of frustration that the player base has. Some of the other things that I did want to discuss was about some of the changes to actually some of the sets. We'll talk about some of the new sets that they introduced with Dragonhold, which are right here. Is the new item sets. It says in this update there are 6 new item sets to obtain, 3 item sets that drop from Southern Elsewhere, and 3 that are crafted. In terms of the ones that are dropped from Overland, at least speaking from a PvP perspective, I mean, you have utility here where you gain an extra 20% movement speed. I really would not trade this for sustain, or for damage, giving up a 5-piece just for the mobility. And of course the mobility lasts for 9 seconds during the duration. Of course it doesn't stack. I mean, it does stack with other mobility, like mobility for example on a Sork with Boundless, but I really don't find it all that useful, because you have Streak is more than enough. Most other classes, it might be kind of situational on a Nightblade, but then you'd be giving up so much damage or so much just for a 5-piece that it doesn't really seem worth it. And you can use something like Shade if you really wanted to create space. I really don't find this to be all that worthwhile, especially because you can just slot things like not Surprise Attack. You can slot things like Concealed Weapon, and while slotted, and of course while cloaked, it gives you an extra, the extra mobility. So I really don't find this set to be all that worthwhile for a magic build. Typically, maybe a Magic Warden, but then again, you're giving up a 5-piece just for the added mobility. I really don't find that very worthwhile from a PvP perspective. In terms of the medium armor set that was added, this set seems like a fairly okay set, but there's a heavy armor set that does the exact same thing. Forgive the traffic. Welcome to life on the first floor in Manhattan. I really don't find this set to be all that great. It does give you about an additional 12% to your critical, but then again, you're giving up a lot of straightforward weapon damage that does scale a lot better than just adding the flat stacks. Also, of course, because it's not, it only stacks when you deal direct damage, which isn't all that bad. It stacks every 1 second. It says each stack increases your weapon critical by 475, so it's just shy of 2500, which is very similar to a little bit more than 10%. It's like 12-13%. But to give up a 5-piece, again, to give up a 5-piece for this, in my opinion, I wouldn't go that route, especially because then, like, for example, if you were running this, like, I typically play no BG. I typically play in BGs, and so your max resources would be really low, and then also your weapon damage would be really low because it only gives you 1 line of weapon damage, which means you'd have to run another set that gives you max resources and enough weapon damage to be able to deal enough damage, because a lot of critical damage can be blocked. You've got things like impen that mitigate the amount of critical damage that people can take. So it doesn't seem like that worthwhile of a set for PvP. It is quite a bit of extra critical, but since the other pieces don't give you like max resources, you end up having a really small pool of stamina to work with. And of course, you have to gain the stacks first for the 5-piece to be worthwhile. They have to have all 5 stacks, so it's a minimum of 5 seconds for you to have all the five stacks. And of course, it requires you to stay in combat, because the stacks fall off, the moment you come out of combat, as they only last 5 seconds. So it seems like kind of meh set. You might be able to get away with it, like if you're running a bow build and you were trying to run just pure burst and not really have a lot of resources. Completely situational, not all that great of a set. In terms of the Central Defender, I do actually like this set, and I actually think that this set is entirely too strong. So you have two, and this is a really good example of maybe not having enough creativity on your combat team, because you have really two very mediocre, I would say very mediocre sets, and then you have an entirely overperforming set. And this is why, because if you actually look at the set, it says it basically gives you 1 line of each resource, and it's a heavy armor set. In my opinion, like the way that they should have gone the heavy armor route was you have a lot of mitigation. You could have gone like heavy mitigation, decent healing, really poor resource management, which is kind of why they added in Constitution passive. And this amount of resource return is ridiculous, because it says dealing direct damage with a non-heavy attack, which is literally like every other source of damage that you're going to do. It says right here, it says attacks grant a persistent stack of the essential duty up to 10 stacks. After dealing direct damage with a fully charged heavy attack, you restore 535 stamina and magicka for each stack, and consume, right? It says up to 10 stacks. After dealing damage with a fully charged heavy attack, you restore. So every time you deal non-heavy attack damage, you basically gain a stack. When you do deal a heavy attack, you basically gain 535 stamina and magicka for each stack of the essential duty, and you consume them. It says you can also gain it says you can only gain 1 stack of essentials basically every 1 second, which isn't all that bad. So 10 stacks, right? Like even if this had a CD of 10 seconds, it really wouldn't matter, because 10 stacks returns 5,035 stamina and magicka. That is the equivalent of 1,070 extra stamina and magicka on a heavy armor build, which kind of the point of running heavy is that you really shouldn't be able to sustain forever. And this set entirely overperforms in terms of sustain, because one, all you have to do as a heavy attack, you already gain extra resources from heavy attacking while you're in heavy armor. So you gain the additional 25% from heavy attacking while in heavy armor, and then you gain this ridiculous, it literally is, right? Because it's 1 stack every second. So all you have to do is deal direct damage 10 times. It doesn't even have to be 10 times. It literally is the equivalent of an extra 535 stamina and magicka every second, because all you have to do is then toss in a heavy attack, which is really easy to do on a sword and shield build. It only takes like about a second to do, and you gain 500 per stack. So if you literally wait 10 seconds, it regenerates 5,350 stamina and magicka. In my opinion, Heavy armor already is really easy to sustain just via heavy attacks. You toss in heavy attacks plus something like Black Rose, Constitution passive, or you just run out. Or if you're especially on DK, like on a DK, you don't even need sustain. I run heavy armor DK, either dual wield or sword and shield, and I'm with like between like 580 and maybe 650 on my stamina regen. I mean, you can take a look at some of the builds here that I run, and I have no problems sustaining in heavy armor because between the heavy attacks with dual wield as well as Constitution passive, you know, especially on a DK, but really on any build, you can sustain so well from just using dual wield heavy attacks because you get so much sustain back that, in my opinion, this set entirely overperforms. Will make you really will be over sustaining with a set like this. In terms of the crafted sets are kind of okay. I really don't find this set in particular, the Ancient Dragon Guard, all that great. The reason being is because you end up losing the weapon damage and or spell damage when you come below 50%. It's important to keep in mind that the weapon damage or spell damage, you know, unless you're running like a percent heal, like for example on a Sork has a lot of percent heals, so it might not necessarily feel the loss, but in most builds, like your weapon damage and your spell damage increase the healing that you receive. So to lose the 300 just to gain the mitigation isn't all that much. It's 3460 in terms of the mitigation that is added, and this doesn't get buffed in terms of any bonuses, right? So for example, the 300 weapon damage, of course, is increased by things like major brutality, minor brutality, major sorcery, and minor sorcery. Like if you're on a Templar, this 300 weapon damage, you know, actually becomes 400 weapon damage. So the amount of mitigation that you're getting from the set is only 3460, right? It's not even an even number. It's 3460, and then in PvP, it's 660 per point of mitigation. So it only offers you 5%. It offers you 5% mitigation, and that mitigation only comes in handy when you're below 50%, and then you end up losing the extra damage, of course, that you would need, as well as the healing that you would get from this ability. In my opinion, I would rather just run something that just gives me the static weapon damage throughout the entire fight, or the static resistance, instead of having it kind of situational. But to each his own. The Daring Corsair says reduces. This is another set that I find to be overperforming. This reduces the cost of your weapon abilities by 10%, whether they're magic or stamina. After casting a weapon ability, you gain minor heroism. This is while in combat. I think that 10% sustain, this would actually be really decent, like I say, slightly decent on a stamina DK. Actually, I think this was the set that I was referring to that overperforms. This set I actually find to be not all that worthwhile, because one, typically if you're using weapon abilities, even if you're running dual wield heavy armor, your dual wield abilities don't really cost that much, because like every weapon set already has cost reduction. So then what you get is you end up getting diminishing returns from the percent reduction. So I don't find it all that great. The minor heroism is kind of meh. I mean, minor heroism is okay after casting a weapon damage, but it's only 0.5. It's only 0.5 extra ultimate that you're getting. So for a 5-piece to gain a mediocre, like that 10% is not going to be 10%. If you're running medium armor, if you're running light armor, if you use any sort of cost reduction, this ends up getting diminishing returns. If, for example, your character has any sort of passive, like in Sork or in any other class that has any sort of cost reduction, like for example Sork already has a built-in cost reduction, so this 10% isn't actually 10%. You end up receiving the diminishing returns, like I said, especially if you're running either light or medium armor. And typically in heavy armor you really don't have the sustain issues because you can heavy attack. I run numerous heavy builds with dual wield and typically don't have a lot of problems to sustaining. So this is yet another mediocre set in terms of a 5-piece, very mediocre for a 5-piece. Now this set, the New Moon Acolyte, in terms of the amount of weapon damage and spell damage that you receive for the very mediocre 5% cost increase, I find this set to be very overperforming, especially because it has both critical weapon damage. There's a lot of damage built into this set. You might be thinking, well, 5% isn't really all that much, because no matter what, like I said, a 5% increase, because of how the percent reductions and increases work, this really doesn't turn into 5%. It actually comes out to be less than that. Who is calling me? It actually turns out to be less than that, and you gain the 100% uptime on 480 damage. Again, that 481 weapon or spell damage is also affected by, for example, major sorcery, and of course major minor sorcery, major brutality, and minor brutality. So that 481 then gets multiplied by 0.3, and then you gain an additional 144 plus 481. So this set actually provides 625 extra weapon and spell damage for the mediocre increase of 5%. I find that to be a lot. It probably should be quite higher. This only, as it says here, it only affects your active abilities, so it doesn't affect things like dodge roll, block. It doesn't affect things like dodge roll and block, sneak, etc. So it's only your active abilities. So things like dodge rolling and block are not going to be affected, but your overall abilities, I mean, running this, for example, like on a weapon build, weapon abilities already have huge amounts of cost reduction, plus stamina abilities are already 15% cheaper. So the extra 5%, especially for the additional 625 weapon damage, that entirely overperforms. Forget about just the rest of the other pieces, the other 4 pieces that give you an extra pen. That's more than 2%. That's more than 2% damage overall. You got an additional, and it gives you both the weapon and critical. And then of course you toss in the additional 129. Of course the 129 is also affected by major minor brutality. So for example, like on a DK or on a Templar, this set is giving you like 800, 100% uptime on this amount of damage. Whereas if you look at things, for example, like the Fury set requires you to proc, it requires you to take damage to actually gain the equivalent amount of weapon damage. And I find this, and this is a crafted set, so you can actually pair this with another set. So you would actually be able to drop Fury, not have to worry about taking the stacks and line of sighting, because you would have this 100%. People for the longest thought Fury overperformed. It still kind of overperforms because stamina abilities can still stack so much more weapon damage than a Magicka build. But this is actually even more overperforming than the Fury set. So for this patch, I really don't find, I think the New Moon Acolyte as well as the Essential Defender would be like your OP, would be like your current OP for the patch. You can actually pair the Essential Defender, which would give you enough resources. This would actually give you sustain, and then you'd have more than enough, because this set gives you like 700, like 800. This set alone is giving you 800 weapon and spell damage, just like ridiculous. In terms of looking at some of the other sets, there were some changes to some of the old sets. I did want to say, if you've played way back, I played this game from beta, and when sets like the agility set came out, and this is how far overperforming a lot of the sets are. When the old version of agility set came out, people were like, that's super strong, because the every other 2-piece only gives you like 1,050 or something for a two piece of in terms of max stamina or max magicka, and usually you get like 129. And way back when, people were like, this is overpowered, this is overperforming, like this should be nerfed, it's entirely too strong in comparison to what was out at that time, that sets like agility, willpower, etc. when they first came out. And to show you how far the power creep has come up in this game, where these sets entirely underperform in most scenarios, where they actually needed to be buffed, where they got buffed like around, what was that, 30% or so. They gained an additional 300 stamina. The weapon damage wasn't buffed all that much, but all of these sets, all of the old sets, got basically a 300 basically to their raw stat, and then like an additional 15 or so Gives you an additional 13 to the maximum amount of weapon damage. Not all that crazy. What I will say is Blessing of Potentates, I ran for the longest. I ran the Akavari set. The 5-piece on the Akavari set gives you the 15% reduction to the alt. That set basically got made useless because of this change. Because one, you gain the player reduction, 5% is important. 5% player reduction, right? Like I said before, player reduction in terms of the amount of damage that you take is equivalent to 660 spell damage and or spell damage, spell resistance or physical resistance, right? So times 5, so 3,300 physical resistance and spell resistance is equivalent to 5% reduction. But this 5% is not affected by like armor bypass, right? So, or things that bypass 100% of your mitigation. So for a 2-piece set, you're actually gaining the equivalent of 3,300 physical and spell resistance, but it's unmitigatable, because even if someone were to use, for example, like the new 2-handed alt, and that bypasses all of your resistance, you'd still receive the extra 5%. So this is very strong. Actually, in terms of for my two-handed DK heavy armor build, I actually ran for the longest. I actually ran the Akavari set for the alt reduction, whereas now I can actually drop this set. What was that one called? I think it was this one. Yeah, this is it. So the 2-piece set on the Akavari provides you with the magic of recovery, right? It provides you with magic recovery. The 4% healing taken, kind of meh. In heavy armor, the additional 1,200, kind of meh. I could do without it, especially because the 5% reduction is actually better than the 4% healing and the extra HP put together. Because once that 1,200 HP is gone, it's actually kind of useless. Whereas the 5% of the player damage reduction is good all the way until you die. The same thing, like the healing reduction is only good, the healing taken is only good when you're being healed. When you're not being healed, it's actually kind of useless. So these 2 pieces right here are easily replaced by this 2-piece right here. So I can actually switch off to run 3 pieces and then run a 2-piece. For example, like the 2-piece willpower set that did get changed over here. Where is it? For the extra 1750 magicka, and of course that magicka also correlates into damage, so that's actually better for me on this build because I really run recovery, so I'd actually rather have the extra damage. The extra damage reduction will create sustain because I'll be taking less damage, which means I'll have to heal myself less, which means I'll have to turtle less. So the extra magicka recovery, basically that 2-piece is basically better than this 4-piece. But in any event, so a lot of these old sets had been changed, they've been buffed, because, you know, and in their time, they were really overperforming and really good. For example, like willpower, most of these sets then got a buff in terms of their spell critical. I really don't see, I mean, outside of for that particular build, one thing that I will say that really got a huge buff, which I think is an overbuff, is, here it is, the endurance set. 618 recovery. That 618 recovery, you know, important, especially, for example, if you're running that 618 recovery is multiplied by, especially if you're running heavy armor with a pot, that's an additional 40% health recovery. And if you're running, like, for example, like either a warden or a Nightblade or a sorcerer, who all have passives that increase the amount of recovery, this 618 can be boosted up to 60%. So you can multiply that by 0.6, and that will give you an additional 370 plus the 618 that this set comes with, and it gives you an additional 988 extra health recovery. And especially because dots got nerfed, I find that this particular set can be a little overperforming, because that is a lot. There's a lot of health recovery that is super buffed by percent increases. For example, when you ever use a pot that has health on it, you're automatically going to gain the extra 20% from there. If you're running 5 pieces of heavy armor, that's an additional 20% health recovery. And then, of course, if you're, like I said before, if you're running either a Nightblade has percent increases to health recovery. The sword class has percent increase, and I also believe Warden has a percent increase. Even Templar has access to the minor recovery. So it can be quite strong. You know, that extra 900 HP recovery, again, that's unaffected by battle spirit. That's a lot of recovery, especially, for example, if you're running like Troll King and you're running either like what's it called, Artaeum food, or if you're running Clockwork food that also gives you HP recovery. Like, you can easily boost your HP recovery, which I run a lot of HP recovery builds for that reason, because damage is so high. It's a really decent change that I probably think can be overperformed in certain builds. With that said, we'll be coming up with some more information about the PTS coming up for next patch. If you liked the video, feel free to like, comment, and subscribe so that the video gets recommended to other people. So if this is your first time here, be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss out on future content. Thanks for watching.